This is 06:43 GMT on Friday, the 7th of August 2020. This is the continuation of the world exclusive diagnosis of the English language papers, collectively known as Fleet Street, of today's date. By English language, I mean English language, English centric, Little English newspapers that actually are still thinking that this is empire. And this is nowhere more prominently, brazenly pronounced than on the front page of the day's Daily Mail. Remember, the Daily Mail was the paper that in the 1930s appeased the German National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party. And it was followed by the Times newspaper, which wasn't, of course, owned by Rupert Murdoch, but it had the same nefarious kind of owners who appeased the National Socialists of Germany, along with many of the leading British politicians. Now, today's Daily Mail has got this pretty sending navy to tackle migrant crisis. Now, Priti Patel is the daughter, self-styled, self-admitted daughter of an immigrant. She is from Africa, although she is of Gujarati Indian origin, but she is from Africa. And she should know, and she should have solidarity with, empathy with, and support for and compassion for what she disdainfully repeats the English-centric races and calling them migrants. And she's treating them as if they were a force of invasion and led by a foreign power. These are people that have been caused this plight, life or death plight, by the desperation imposed on them by the war traders and the continuers of empire economic system. And instead of sympathizing with those victims, and instead of solidarizing with their plight, Priti Patel says they send the Navy to tackle the migrant crisis. This is not anywhere near the emergency situation caused by the migrants arriving, no matter what the number. The situation faced by Britain and the economy, which is admitted in the inside page of the Daily Mail, is the one caused by the economy. The economy is seriously in trouble, and the Daily Mail admits that on the inside page. We are facing worst recession in century. And it has got the Bank of England forecasters for cutting the number of years or the period in which this worst recession is located, which was previously 300 years and now it is 100 years. Even if it is 50 years, it still is a dire situation, and the economy is facing the prospect of getting worse by the day, because the pandemonium government, controlled by this guy, the weirdo, is not delivering the protection, the service, and the integrity, and the fairness, and the real freedom to the entrepreneurs and the citizens, so-called, or the British people or the public. So this is not the headline that the Daily Mail should be running, because these people, even if the migrants, any number, even if they cross into the UK, they are never at large, and they're never going to interfere with anything in society in Britain. They are virtual prisoners, and they're prisoners even before they set foot on the British soil, no matter how many of them succeed in getting there. So this is irresponsibility on the part of the Daily Mail, and there is nothing. There is no sign of any force or power or influence or movement or campaign that is visible or foreseeable in the near future that can stop the Daily Mail becoming the inciter in principle, the principal inciter or the inciter in chief of hatred and antagonism, intolerance, and complete and utter racism. Most of these people, the migrants, they're not migrants, they're actually Asians and Africans. Hardly any European people from Europe of the same kind of ethnic backgrounds or general genetics or backgrounds that is shared by most of the Daily Mail's stooge readers and puppet readers and subjects of brainwashing. So these people are Asians and Africans. And look at the Asians and African scenes. These are war fields, areas of warfare being imposed, caused by the interests of British big business and warmongers. And there is no sign anywhere in the coverage of this incitement of anything that the so-called democratic opposition fronted by Keir Starmer is saying, or any of his so-called shadow cabinet members is saying about this. As we said yesterday, when Corbyn was still in place, and he was in his early days as the leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the opposition in Parliament, in the House of Commons, he faced David Cameron at Prime Minister's question times. And in one of those question times, David Cameron taunted Jeremy Corbyn by insulting him with the allegation, as if it was an allegation, as if it was a wrong thing to do, that Corbyn had visited a handful of migrants or asylum seekers or whatever. And that taunting voice and the taunting words were absolutely brazen evidence of David Cameron being individually a racist hater and a violator of British obligations under various treaties that Britain was already signatory to, and still now, this day, today, 7th of August 2020, UK remains a signatory to various charters, declarations, and treaties that expressly uphold the rights of people who are caused to flee their home for safety and security. And yet, there is no evidence that Corbyn ever understood that. Corbyn never made any headlines or headings upholding even the treaties, let alone the actual contents and the implications of those treaties. Now, compared to Corbyn, who was not a lawyer by any means, and he is not a campaigner, Corbyn, contrary to the myths created about him, and there is this guy who is described and unoriginally imitated by Corbyn in the description as the forensic intellect called Keir Starmer. Now, the forensic, like competence, on its own is meaningless. It depends on what he is examining forensically, and it depends on the agenda. Now, Keir Starmer has failed to forensically apply his so-called, of course, overstated forensic skills and abilities in examining the racism inherent in the behavior of MPs, in the behavior of government ministers, in the behavior of the media. So that is not surprising, but that is the fact. And that is what I'm saying today when there is no sign of any rebuttal or rebuff to Priti Patel's conveying on behalf of her racist controllers and masters and mistresses the racist hatred message. Now, how long, the question is, how long can Britain and the British economy, the British society trade on racist hatred against some of the world's most helpless and in need of help, vulnerable people put in that position by the behavior and the conduct of British big business and the British capitalist forces and interests and the British state that is still operating as an agency of big business and an extension of the idea and the ideology of the East India Company or similar. Now, this race hatred will come back to haunt this society as the Black Lives Matter movement, not necessarily the actual events around the Black Lives Matter so far have demonstrated or proven. But racism is going to become the opposite coin and the currency of many countries and the many societies in Africa and Asia in time to come, that Britain will be penalized for being so racist and hostile, just like the slavery of the past few hundred years is now coming back to haunt some of them. The racism, which they still think they can use it as a currency for political, potent currency for political exploitation to keep themselves in power, this will come back to haunt them. And the sooner Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, realize that, the more appreciated they will be in the eyes of decent people, and the decent people will always make the indecent people lose out in the end, eventually, because the evidence, the fact, the truth will triumph, despite the fact that the racists and the liars and the haters, for the moment, they get the headlines and they get the platform. And there has to be legislation. No MP in the House of Commons, or in the House of Parliament, House of Lords, so called, is even remotely talking about bringing the likes of the Daily Mail into moral accountability, ethical accountability, social accountability. There is no such thing as a free press. They say it's owned by the people and it's a business. If that is the case, then there has to be a parallel movement, corresponding movement against the antisocial business that spreads and relies on and depends on hatred. Now, hatred is toxic and it destroys the economy, it destroys the person, it destroys the social relations, it destroys the family, it destroys everything. So that is something that Corbyn never grasped. And Keir Starmer is not showing any interest in grasping. And we move on to the point about this lack of compassion and the hatred, the dependence on hatred is being fueled also by the so-called domestic agenda in terms of making the domestic people who are in low income and poor pay for the profit and the greed of the owners of the means of production and the owners of the businesses. And Charlie Marx has to be updated by a number of his key phrases being edited and updated and modernized. And the means of production is something that needs to be updated and actually brought up to date to take into account the various factors that now affect the society. Now, the Beirut explosion is again on the inside pages 14 and 15 of the Daily Mail. And it is not, significantly, it is not reporting in any way that can be seen on this page the actual words that France's President Emmanuel Macron, received in Beirut yesterday. France, remember, is the colonial power that ruled Beirut for a long time. And so therefore France has got a direct kind of relationship. And so he was given a hero's welcome, it says, for Macron amid the ruins. He was given the hero's welcome, but it doesn't actually say what legacy France left to Beirut, to Lebanon, of empire. Because the corruption that is being held responsible and the overall dysfunction that is being held responsible for the storing of the explosives in the port. These are direct continuation of the effects and consequences of French imperialism in Lebanon. And as I said yesterday, Lebanon is in a mess. And that is because of it being one of the relics, one of the victims of empire and imperialism. And the empire and imperialism, the French is linguistic, it's cultural, so much as economic and social and religious, because the religious divisions and factionalism in Lebanon are direct products and consequences of what the French did during the colonial period, just as the British did in the subcontinent during 1757 to 1947. And they're still doing it in a vicarious way. They are continuing to do it. And we shall come to the various examples in due course. The Daily Mail has got a piece on page 21 about the Saudi, what is called Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And it said that he sent a hit squad to get somebody killed. Now that's not news really, because that is not a one-off thing in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is a kingdom that has got literally people in slavery, people from Bangladesh, people from India, Pakistan, and the Philippines, Thailand, and other places in South Asia. They've got people there working in virtual slave conditions. There is no democracy. And Saudi Arabia is an extension of the arms traders' agenda and platforms. The arms traders, of course, based in the West and America. Now, on pages 24 and 25 of the Daily Mail, it is promoting the cause of nudity and nakedness, and it is paying loads of money to Ulrika Johnson. Not going into details about that at all. So that is the morality. She is absolutely lacking in morality, the Daily Mail. That is not what it should be spreading about moms and daughters. It should be talking about the poor people whose plight in poverty and deprivation is beneath the level that they admit exists in this country, and beneath the level that should be allowed under the obligations of the international treaties and declarations and agreements which the UK signed and remains signed up to. So in the newspapers, there is no maturity, there is no responsible journalism, and this paper is a flagship of racist hatred, anti-migrant hatred, and there is no recognition of the fact that these migrants, most of them, are coming or aiming to come to Britain from parts of the world where Britain interfered severely in the entirety of the countries as colonialist power and interferer and imposer of post-colonial wars and discord and disharmony and violence on those countries. So there is a piece on the front page of the I newspaper, which was the only newspaper yesterday that actually made a significantly different point about the deregulation of the house building kind of laws. And this is the second day. It's saying the demolition of planning rules hands more power to number 10. Now that's an obvious statement, or the statement of the obvious. What this piece should be saying is, what are the local councils currently doing, and what is the opposition MPs in parliament doing, and what are the so-called opposition members in the so-called House of Peers are doing to stem the tide of deregulation and the return to darkness. It says leading Tories and local authorities warned that easing restrictions could lead to lower quality properties. It doesn't talk about the rights. It talks about lower quality properties, but it is not enough. It has to be rights and the entitlements of people to have safety in their homes and safe buildings, and quite apart from the fact that they have to have the guaranteed right to home. Prime Minister's radical reforms will deny councils the right to decide on building applications. Now, that is not true. That is not true, because the I newspaper, although generally it has got the line slightly different from the servile line being pushed by the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Express and the Telegraph, the Daily Mail still get it wrong, because it is not correct to say that the councils have the right to decide on building applications. They don't. The councils operate the option to consider building applications as a way to get money. It is abused, and it is not something that is held to account by the councils, and there is a pretext that the planning committee is a quasi-judicial committee, which means that it's not strictly political. That is absolutely true. But the way to get rid of that quasi-judicial excuse to keep the truth of the behavior of the council's planning bodies and planning operations from the community, from the electors, is to do it politically. And there is no sign that the Labour Party has ever actually wanted to get the local people, the electors, the say on planning. If it did, you wouldn't have all these very tall buildings suddenly rising in the last 10 years in Tower Hamlets, in the Aldgate area, Aldgate East area, and similar parts in other parts of London. And Thangam Debonair, who is the so-called shadow or the opposition spokesperson on housing and planning in this context, is nowhere to be seen in the main news coverage in the Fleet Street papers. So the Fleet Street papers are not going to rush to her for a comment. She has to issue intelligent, democratic, accountable, transparency raising demands. And she hasn't done that. And the same is the case with Jeremy Corbyn, who is now shadowing his successor as the leader, Keir Starmer. Because Corbyn is running a side show from the Facebook and other bots populated fan base, and Corbyn is issuing statements that any harmless member of the community can raise if they don't have any direct political impact on the decisions that are being made in the name of the country, in the name of the society, in the name of the general public by the people who are in occupation of the executive positions, making decisions. And this is the typical pattern of the empty opposition in this country. And as I said, I mean, this is absolutely recurrent. The Green Party and the Lib Dems are not making any waves. They are not making any difference to the agenda of regressive dark age backwardness that is being pushed brazenly and irresponsibly and illegally, unconstitutionally by the Johnson-fronted brigade. And that is obvious in the contents of the papers called the Fleet Street papers today. And the I newspaper has a token column by Aisha Hazarika. Hazarika is a name from Assam, which is not far from Bangladesh. In fact, Sylhet and Assam were together for 100 years and even longer. So Hazarika is an Assamese name. So Aisha Hazarika, who was born in Scotland, is actually either her father is from Assam or her mother is from Assam. It is more likely that her father is from Assam. And that is where her connection with Assam ends, because she is writing like she doesn't come from that kind of background. And there she loses the moral authority, the moral connection, the moral right, the evidential right to assert against the immorality, the lack of compassion, and the racism that is surrounding her in the Fleet Street market, where she is given a space after she failed several attempts to get a winnable nomination as a Labour Party nominee for Parliament. She decided that it was more profitable, personally beneficial for her to serve as the second Yasmin Alibai. Of course, Hazarika is far less hostile to the general Muslims than Yasmin Alibai has been in her pursuit of a career as a token Muslim woman in the anti-Muslim media in Britain. And Hazarika, therefore, doesn't cause much comment, hostile comment, that Yasmin Alibai receives from racists, because Yasmin Alibai sometimes forgets that she remains a target of racists, no matter how pro-racistly assimilatory her gestures have been. And this is the actual identity of the British media, if it is the platform, if it is the identity, if it is the embodiment daily of what constitutes British and Britain culturally and in terms of the public platform. Now, the Daily Express, which has always been very right wing and very much pro authoritarian culture and regimes, has got this lying headline and the photograph showing Boris Johnson as a Superman, super fit, and it is saying that the economy is almost recovered and almost saved. And inside, as if the front page was not enough or clear enough, it has the 2-page spread showing Boris Johnson as a Superman, which is absolutely untrue. And so therefore it says opening schools and workplaces will help get our economy on the move, says Boris. But there is no recognition that people who are opposing opening schools and so forth are not doing so because they are careless. In fact, they are the ones who care about the safety of people in this country. And so therefore the Daily Express is pursuing an irresponsible, antisocial, anti-societal agenda narrative in order to remain on the side of Boris Johnson and the Tories, and they're prepared to peddle the myths that support the herd immunity, which is mass murder of people, as happened in the last few months in care homes and others. And this is what Ruth Lee, economic advisor, they are describing Ruth Lee. Ruth Lee is a ruthlessly corrupt ideologue. Corrupt in the sense that she distorts the evidence. And she's one of the far right occupants of platforms on the media who has been spewing absolute untruths about society, about economy, about equality, about justice, and all the other things that they deny. So Ruth Lee is a commentator. People who are not in Britain and looking at this video should know that this is very important, because most people don't get to appear on mainstream BBC or ITV or Sky News or Channel 4 or print media platforms as often and as frequently without any challenge as Ruth Lee does. And the contents, the sum total of her contribution is absolute pack of lies and denials. Because if Ruth Lee were followed, then society would be even worse than it already is under the Tories. And so therefore, there is an emptiness from the opposition. There is no counter to Ruth Lee and what she spews in today's Daily Express from the Labour Party. There is nothing in the Daily Mirror. We'll come to the Daily Mirror and the Guardian. Now, there is a piece on the Daily Express on page 11 about how few killers of the police have been jailed, given life terms in the last 10 years. Now, that is something that is very important. It is not just about the treatment given to killers of police persons, but it is about the whole legal system or the court system, the sentencing system, and the judicial system. Again, there is nothing coming from the so called forensic intellectual Keir Starmer's led Labour Party front bench about any of this. So the right and the right being wrong on issues of social importance have got one-sided play in the British media today, as they have had for the last 200 years. And this is where the Labour Party's failure lies and is exposed. I have been examining the daily evidence of the British Fleet Street and the broadcasting media since the broadcast media became normally part of the main delivery of quote news or propaganda. And the evidence is what I rely on, not my opinion. The evidence is the Labour Party has been absent, as has been the so called left. Private Eye, which is a right wing outlet, and it runs a weird kind of journalists competition annually, which is called Paul Foot Award. Now, Paul Foot was the editor of the Socialist Worker, which is supposed to be the left-wing weekly, and it was the organ of the Socialist Party, Socialist Workers Party, or Socialist Workers in Britain. In the 70s, it was called International Socialists, or IS, not to be confused with the IS of these days. But in the 1970s, when I had contacts with Paul Foot, because he contacted me in the mid 1970s when he was editor of the Socialist Worker. He was briefly editor of the Socialist Worker. And he got my name wrong. And when I later had many appearances with him as part of the campaign, not with him, but I was along with him present at various events that were held in support of Philip A.G. and Mark Hosenball. There was two Americans that were the subject of deportation orders by the then Labour government Home Secretary Marlene Rees. Paul Foot never actually spoke to me. Not that I needed him to speak to me, but that shows the social distancing by the socialist icon. The Private Eye is now portraying him along with the Guardian. The Private Eye and the Guardian jointly run this Paul Foot Investigative Journalist Award annually. Now, their narrative about Paul Foot is that he was morally superior to his right-wing racist counterparts. Paul Foot was not morally superior. He was another white person doing his career. And the record of Paul Foot's contributions actually defy the claim that he was exceptionally morally, intellectually, ethically of a higher quality and caliber. He was not. If he were, he would not have failed to remember me when I spoke to him in Fleet Street. He was coming from one direction, I was going from another direction, and I thought we say hello. He said he didn't recognize me. How is it two human beings have been present at various events together or alongside one another? One remembers the other, but the other doesn't remember. How do you explain that? And Paul Foot was definitely one of the races that has been celebrated as an anti-racist. What I'm saying is that in 1978, when Al-Tabali was murdered in the east end of London, in Whitechapel. About that time, about the same time, there was the beginning of an externally anti-racist platform, cobbled together by racists in the Socialist Workers' Party. They called it Anti-Nazi League. Now, the Anti-Nazi League had been already in existence, with the main socialist worker member, Paul Holbrook, fronting the outfit. And there were others who were not socialist workers members, but they were, quote, treated as celebrities, like Peter Haque. Peter Haque acquired or had acquired a celebrity status from his South African origin or Southern African origin background, being used as a big, shocking, revolutionary act when he took action against the South African visiting white rugby players, Springbok, at Headingley. Now, these collections of various varieties of races keep making careeristic slogans about racism, and yet they don't give up their positions. Just like Paul Ford didn't move from his position that he didn't recognize who I was. Now, my record as a campaigner, as an investigator, had been far longer and far more extensive by any measure than Paul Ford could ever match. So therefore, I was not in need of him recognizing me. I don't think he was in need of being recognized by me, that I say in fairness, but I wasn't. But that was his assumption. So to read in his biography that he was born in Palestine is an outrageous, grotesque insult to every victim of racism, which Paul Ford either personally practiced or peddled on behalf of others or in collaboration with others. When Paul Ford spoke, along with the other campaigners supporting Philip A.G. and Mark Rosenball, he assumed that he had the moral high ground higher than other people present at the gathering. He never said, even as a possibility, that people present there, like myself, would come or had come from backgrounds that had direct contacts with the denial of liberty and freedom that Rosenball and AG were being treated with. So the assumption remains true that Corbyn, he spouts anti-racist slogan, but he's never given up his position in order to make sure that an African person or an Asian person or a Muslim person, whoever is under whatever racist form. So this is a diagnostic analysis of the media and the people involved in the media, and Paul Ford Award is not celebrating the opposition to racism, the opposition to empire, although they gave an award to the writer on The Guardian a few years ago for allegedly doing the investigation in the hostile environment and the mainly Jamaican and Caribbean immigrants who have been badly treated and whose rights have been denied by the by the UK governments and authorities. And that is an absolute myth, because whatever that particular awardee wrote or investigated pales into insignificance when compared to the daily investigation and daily interrogation and daily digging into the facts that I have been doing, and I'm sure several others have been doing without getting any platform or recognition in that way. Not that I crave that kind of recognition. I am beyond that kind of need. I'm just pointing out in diagnosing the behavior. Now, this is a two-page spread on the Daily Express. This two-page spread is devoted to a novelist about this person. Now, the writer is Sophia Money Coates. Sophia Money Coates is a right-wing reactionary racist that has got platforms on the mainstream so-called Fleet Street media. And anything she writes would be perpetuating that same agenda narrative. So these people don't celebrate, well, not only do they not celebrate the triumphs against adversity that are experienced by quite a few people from African, Caribbean, Asian backgrounds in this country. They don't even notice them. They don't celebrate them, they don't even notice them. And so therefore, today's Fleet Street newspapers are actually the continuation of the racist denial and patronizing the people, black people. They're patronizing now, they're not insulting directly. They're patronizing the mode in the British media towards the mainly African origin black people is in the context of the Black Lives Matter. They don't say things like bloody Africans, which David Starkey used the phrase. They say less obviously racist and offensive things, but they remain practitioners of the same racist prejudice and discrimination and distancing. What Paul Foot did 40 years ago in Fleet Street was socially distancing himself from me. That is what the racists do. They socially distance themselves from people that they perceive to be either a threat to them in terms of the ability, or they think that they don't matter. Whichever is the reason or the motivation, it is racist and they must be stopped. Paul Foot was not the only one. There is another one called Peter Hitchens, brother of the late Christopher Hitchens. Peter Hitchens, as I have said before, not today, but in another broadcast or more than one broadcast, Peter Hitchens was leaving the porn billionaire Dirty Desmond's acquisition of the Daily Express at the time, when I was sitting on a bench on the bank of the River Thames on a summer day afternoon. And I saw him and I recognized him and I said hello. Now that's a very basic social thing. He was just passing by. And as I had been studying his contributions, I thought I'd say hello and have a chat. Because whatever he writes or wrote so far in his column in the Daily Express was not the full story. So it required a kind of treatment, examination And I thought I'd have that. But he wouldn't have the time or the inclination to have a conversation with me. Not because of what I was capable of talking about if he sat there or he stopped there talking to me. He saw me, and he saw me as an Asian person. So he said that he was diffident. The word he used, Peter Hitchens, was diffident. He was diffident because he was not familiar with me and he didn't know who I was. He didn't have to. I was just making a safe, very pleasant, decent hello. That was all I was doing. So when I encountered that kind of racism, I am reminded of the 1962 publication from Dhaka, which was then in East Pakistan, by the so-called Pakistan Press Syndicate. The Pakistan Press Syndicate in 1962 was owned by a man, Aziz Ahmad Bilyamini. Now, what that name says about his family or his background, I will not go into at this stage, but it is not a normal, ordinary majority representative demographic kind of name. So Aziz Ahmad Bilyamini also owned a publication called Young Pakistan, which I wrote in gratis. Of course, I never wrote for money. And I wrote for ideas. And I took up challenges. And I did that from the early 60s. And Bilyamini was an anti-East Pakistani moron. Aziz Ahmad Bilyamini was one of those morons that gave credence to the idea that Muslims in 1946-47 had abused their political position and had spread hatred against the Brahmins and the Brahminists. Here I distinguish between Hindu ordinary people and Brahmins and Brahminists. The Brahminists are now in power, in control through the BJP in India, and their front person is the person widely accused of massacre in Gujarat in the beginning of the century. Now, these people that came from various backgrounds and settled in what was then East Pakistan, people like Aziz Ahmad Bilyamini, they had nothing but contempt for the ordinary people in what was then East Pakistan. Now, that was not what they should have had, because it was only only few years, maybe 10 years or so, at the before the actual kind of settlement began to take shape. In the late 40s, throughout the whole of the 1930s, there were street battles between groups of Muslims and groups of Hindu Brahmins attacking Muslims and vice versa. In some places, the Muslims were in majority, so when they attacked, innocent Hindus got murdered and massacred, and more Muslims died than Hindus. But counting the number is not the main point. The point is that there was an atmosphere of hostility based on religion, and it was actually, the hostility was encouraged, incited by the predecessors of what is now the BJP. And they were the ones who later murdered Mahatma Karamchand Gandhi. And this prevailed because the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League were at loggerheads in terms of what would happen when the British left, because the signs were that the British would leave, all kinds of reasons. it is not the time to list those reasons in this particular diagnostic discussion of the British Fleet Street today, Friday, the 7th of August 2020. Suffice to say that those people who came to settle in East Pakistan but were not East Pakistanis included the likes of Aziz Ahmad Bilyamini. Now, Bilyamini was contemptuous of the people of Dhaka, the ordinary people of East Pakistan. I was from Sylhet, but it doesn't matter because he counted me as one of the East Pakistanis. And he was ungrateful and he was contemptuous, as I said. And based on his contempt for the people, he set up this publication called Pakistan Press Syndicate, and he published under that banner a 70 plus pages long so-called book called Major A.F. Mohsin Ali. And the title of that book was Pakistani Manners, English Etiquette and Pakistani Manners. So Pakistani Manners and English Etiquette. I shall check the actual title and I shall update this later. Now the point is, the thesis of that particular publication was to undermine the whole Pakistani population, in East Pakistanis, West Pakistanis, in comparison with the English or the British or the colonialists. Now that is the kind of mental servitude and slavery that Thomas Babington Macaulay had dreamt of 130 years earlier when he had deliberated on and spoke about the 1830s India education legislation, where he said that the Indians, meaning of all religions, would be externally brown and internally English. And the method to make them internally English was to scrap the main major languages spoken and used by the people, millions of people in the subcontinent, and replace it with English. Again, an updated commentary on that will be posted and recorded later in due course. Essentially, what I'm saying is that the press in the so-called post-colonial Pakistan was not controlled by post-colonialist or anti-colonialist editors, especially not those that were in the English language. And the Young Pakistan was written in a colonialist language, patronizing language, and it wasn't the platform for speaking against the essential evils of empire and imperialism, injustice, inequality, unfairness. So the Pakistan that was in place after 47 was not an independent-minded Pakistan. The people who were in control of the media mostly were not independent-minded. That was the case with the Young Pakistan, but it was the case of with other people doing other publications, editing and setting the script for the other publications, the titles. And I say this because the Pakistani Manners and English Etiquette, I think is the name of the A.F. Mohsin Ali's book. And it is a derogatory commentary about the manners of the Pakistanis, meaning the people of West Pakistan, Bangladesh today, and other people across the subcontinent. And the reason why the Hindus and the Muslims were fighting were centrally to do with what the imperialists did in the 1850s, 1840s, 1830s. They wanted to keep the Sikhs, the Muslims, the Hindus separate and at loggerheads so that they could rule the. It's divide and rule, but it's not as simple as it sounds. It's a complicated, detailed process that entails all kinds of brainwashing and stoogery and stooging and lack of self consciousness and lack of contact with the knowledge and the truth. And what happened in the 1930s and the 40s between Muslims fighting Hindus and Hindus fighting Muslims was to do with also the alternative that was on the horizon, led by Subhash Bose, who was trying to get together an Indian national army. And because of the threat that the British perceived in his preparation, they expedited, rushed the hostility between Muslims and Hindus because Bose was trying to unite all the faith groups, and there were volunteers to his army from all backgrounds, regardless of whether they were Hindus or Muslims or Sikhs. That's why they targeted Bose. And today, up to this day, Bose is nowhere near recognized by anything the British have any say on. But the denial of Bose's role as a unifier is not just to be found in the behavior of the British post 1947 to this day, it is also in the official behavior of the states in Pakistan and in India. The regimes do not want to recognize Subhash Bose. We'll come to doing a full biographical update on Subhash Bose in due course, but this is just a reference in context. Now, the diagnosis of the racist Daily Express must include a look at page 25 of today's paper, where the first paragraph reads, "The Queen and the BBC journalist Emily Maitlis have been named among Vogue's 25 most influential women of the year." Now, that is the display of Emily Maitlis. Well, if that is the case, then Vogue obviously have been on another planet, because Emily Maitlis is a racist liar, and she owes me an apology, and she has owed me an apology for 16 years now. I will update on Emily Maitlis and her lying in due course another time, but this is the influential 25 people led by the Queen and Emily Maitlis. Anne Mensa, Asma Khan, Bernardine Evaristo, Caroline Rush, Charlotte Tilbury, Daisy Edgar Jones, Dawn Butler, Dr. Harris, Emily Maitlis, Emma Reeby, Florence Pugh, Francis O'Grady, June Sarpong, Lisa Bilal and Naomi Smith, Maria Bolso, Michaela Coel, Monroe Bergdorf, Nicole Jacobs, Pippa Creer, Professor Sarah Gilbert, Rihanna, Rosh Mahtani, Silvano, Mensa, Asma Khan, Bernardine Evers. These are the people that they've listed, but there is no actual summary of description of what they are being listed for. Dawn Butler is, of course, an MP, and Dawn Butler is an MP, and Emily Maitlis, of course, the Newsnight presenter. And Pippa Creer is the political editor of the Daily, is it the Daily Mirror or the Guardian? I think she's the Guardian journalist. I could be wrong because I'm not following her as a fan. So she could be either on the Mirror or the Daily or the Guardian. And the Queen is the last on the list. But, and the Sarpong is a Blair serving ethnic surrogate that was given platforms by the media during Blair's time in the number 10. And so therefore this is a celebration of these people. Now I have pointed out Emily made lies, so the list is contaminated. And of course the Queen would be there compulsorily in any list of women, so that is not surprising. And it means nothing. It means nothing because they don't say how these people are influential and what they have influenced. And we shall leave that there because to examine, scrutinize each one of them would take up longer than there is allocated for this program or this edition. Now, on this page, the opposite page, page 24, is the thug admits trying to stab stranger to death as she pushed toddler in pram. The thug is, of course, brazen. It's a brazen, sounds like brazen. So brazen is the name of the African descended person. Now, the question is, that serves as an advertisement for the racists, categorizing people who look like him or come from the similar background as racially prone to commit crimes. This is why it is so important for people of the African Caribbean backgrounds and people of the Asian and the Muslim backgrounds to take steps to educate members of the community, the youngsters and adults, about the implication of their behavior in a society that is as racist and as hostile as Britain. There is no platform, there is no media that is doing that. And I'm saying that that should be done. And this is why we are saying in the campaign against racism that it is not good enough for spouting slogans about racism. You have to look at the behavior. And the councils, local councils, which are locally funded, locally based and funded centrally and also locally from council tax and other revenues, to serve the local people, and they're not serving the local people, and the deficit and the deficiency is absolutely lethal and deadly. Now, can you imagine the Daily Express is celebrating the most notorious secret society? They're saying that the Freemasons are misunderstood and they're promoting the Freemasons. If the Masons are misunderstood, why don't they stop being secret? That is the question. And the Guardian is continuing the series about the various risks that are entailed in easing the lockdown and in not sufficiently funding the NHS. And it is perpetuating the myth about councils doing good, more good than bad. The headline on page 4 of today's Guardian is councils to get better data amid concern about 10 billion central system. And this is something that the Guardian does most often, promotes the local councils as the positive at the expense of the accountability and the duty that they failed to deliver. Now on page 10, the Guardian is continuing discussion about generic, about housing, and the relaxation of the building control and the regulation. The West Ferry Print Works, a vibrant new waterfront neighborhood, Dyer and Butler. That is the picture from Tower Hamlets on the Isle of Dogs. West Ferry Print Works. This is the first time with the background that shows Canary Wharf and other buildings. And it is the picture that is being run by the Guardian in the story, which is focused still on Gendrick's violation of the planning regulation. And he's giving the go ahead to the porn billionaire's planning application for West Ferry Printworks luxury degenerating house building project. Now, the Steve Reed, the shadow housing secretary. Now, this is a news to me because Thangam Debonair was the one, but when did Steve Reed become the shadow housing secretary? I will check and I'll update accordingly. This is the statement that Steve Reed has been quoted as making about this deregulation regime on planning control, so called. Robert Gendrick moved heaven and earth to help a multi-billionaire Tory donor, Richard Desmond, avoid paying vital infrastructure funding to one of the most deprived boroughs in the country. Now he wants to legislate to prevent more of the Tories' developer friends from paying their dues. Now, Steve Reed is a former leader of the Labour Lambeth Council. Lambeth Council has been in serial problems with its leaders and with its councillors. And Steve Reed was no friend of the local campaigners, most of the issues. And Steve Reed's quotation here is empty because it doesn't actually relate to the infrastructure levy, to the local communities' housing needs, or the local council's behavior in allocating housing resources and in assessing the housing needs. Least of all, talk about the role the local councils play in creating, causing housing shortage and problems as happened in Tower Hamlets. It is not only one of the most deprived boroughs generally in the country, but it is one of the boroughs from which thousands of council controlled, council owned housing stock were robbed and looted by Tony Blair through the stock transfer. Now, that is where the largest number of stock transfer took place, and that caused absolutely nightmarish number of sudden new additions to homelessness and housing crisis. On top of Tower Hamlets Council built-in clique of crooks making the decisions, causing people to be homeless. And this is the diagnosis of the paper. So the role of Tower Hamlets Council will be examined chapter and verse after we finish talking about Newham Council, and that will take a few broadcasts. And then we'll come to Tower Hamlets and examine chapter and verse of how corrupt Tower Hamlets Council is, has been, and remains. Now, the sketch on The Guardian, page 11, by John Crace, is centered on the building deregulated regime that Johnson is pushing. And that is against a picture of Johnson fiddling with a wall, apparently posing as a builder. And John Crace is making a kind of typical critical remark, but he is not talking about the council's role. He's talking about Clement Attlee. Attlee was briefly an MP from the East End, but Attlee was an MP for another constituency. But Attlee is remembered in East London, in Tower Hamlets, by Attlee House in the complex where the Toynbee Hall is. But Attlee is remembered here by John Crace in The Guardian. He's a political sketch writer. Predictably, Honest Bob was upbeat and bullish as he went out on the morning media round. He's talking about, obviously, he's talking about Boris Johnson as Honest Bob, but so he isn't a man used to being challenged. So the government white paper would cut through all the blockages and NIMBYism created by the Attlee government. All talk of a bonfire of deregulations and an assault on local democracy was just scaremongering. For a start, it was obvious developers would be desperate to build their fair share of affordable homes. It merely depended on your interpretation of the word affordable. The very idea that developers might try to get around any regulations by knocking up box-like slum dwellings in growth areas was unthinkable, mainly because the regulations were being removed so there would be none to get round. Trust me, said the honest Bob, his voice the liquid honey of someone who expects to be believed. Only it turned out that Nick Robinson on the Radio 4 Today program didn't necessarily trust him. Didn't honest Bob have phone? That is not Boris Johnson. That is Bob, meaning Robert Gendry. Hadn't he sat at the same dinner table as Richard Dirty Desmond at a Tory fundraising dinner? And hadn't Dirty Des showed him a video of his West Ferry development proposal? And hadn't Honest Bob given the development, despite the objections of the local council, the green light the day before Dirty Des would have had to fork out £40 million for the infrastructure projects? And hadn't his decision been later deemed unlawful? So what bit of a Gendrick's planning proposals were we supposed to have faith in? Gendrick wasn't used to being spoken to like that. Didn't anyone at the BBC know who he was? As it happened, they did. And Nick Robinson is being given full credit for quizzing Robert Gendrick on the particular Today program edition that John Grace is celebrating. But John Grace, in common with the Guardian, rest of the Guardian, is again allowing the local council's image to remain outside of this scrutiny. Tower Hamlets Council, as I have said, hundreds of times, based on hundreds of items of evidence that keep piling, is a prime causer of housing shortage, housing problems. And affordability is, of course, something that Grace has not really fully examined. Affordability is not the same thing anywhere near the same thing as socially needed, socially provided housing. Affordability is a market phrase and market word. Anyone can afford anything if they have the money. And the point about social housing, the point about Attlee government in the 1940s was that people in need needed the support regardless of their income. And that is where the welfare state and the NHS, point of need, and all the other social moves came from. And they're being destroyed by the by the Tories and the Labour Party being silent, and Labour leadership being found in modes of garden gnomism. And the Guardian has got lots of items about children losing out and the poverty being increased by the Tories' measures in every way. Here is an item of the Guardian saying, why are voters not paying attention to the Labour Party's economic policy? That is Larry Elliott. Now, this is the comment that I will not read in full, but suffice to say that Larry Elliott is saying, factually, the Labour is not offering the economic answer to the Tories. And the other item in the Guardian that I need to refer to as part of the diagnosis is, of course, the editorial comment against Robert Jenrick and the judicial review. And the Guardian is actually promoting the image of the English judiciary as being responsible and just. That's not the case, but we shall be examining that in another edition. This is the Daily Mirror front page. This is the only front page that talks about Dominic Cummings having broken second lockdown trip. That is the word trip that was missing from sight when I was looking at it earlier. And the Guardian doesn't have anything really different in terms of the general agenda than the Daily Mirror, except that the Daily Mirror is running an editorial calling for Cummings to be investigated. And the Daily Star, which is a sister paper of the Daily Mirror, is running a similarly good news piece celebrating light-hearted environment. And there is nothing about housing, unemployment, and most certainly not about racism in the Daily Express. So if these people are reading, whoever is reading this kind of press, what are the findings in the papers? There is not much of a thought, food for thought. And the Times is not really running anything about Lebanon, except that on page 2 it says that Starmer has overtaken Johnson as voters' choice of Prime Minister. It is saying that Boris Johnson has got 32%, -1 from the last such question, and Keir Starmer has got 34, plus 3 points since the last time this was posed in the poll. And so the Times is generally very safe and not challenging much, except that on pages 6 and 7 it is running for the conservative councils about the housing planning deregulation juggernaut that he is pushing. And that is not ideologically or evidentially, let alone socially, responsible of the times, because it doesn't address the root corruption in the existing system, which should be made democratically transparent and accountable and responsive and responsible to the local communities and the local people in need of housing. And the whole environment should be taken into account. The impact on the environment, the implication of the lack of safety regulations that we have seen in Tower Hamlets, the crane collapse, and the toddler being thrown or falling from the 8th floor in Poplar High Street, East India Dock Road near Poplar, in Poplar generally, and the death of Miss Bo in 2018 in the Badet Road from falling bricks, and the death of the 5-year-old child in the Mile End playground on 17th of July 2015. There is this comment by Philip Collins in the Times on page 23, which is absolutely false. The main headline is, "We need more than homes to level up Britain." That is a clear reference to the Labour, previously Labour supporting voters in the North, who supported the Conservatives on the 12th of December 2019. But the subheading says, "Tory planning reforms are a welcome boost for house building, but ministers must focus on jobs to keep their election pledge." That is saying that they should be looking at the serious unemployment that is spreading across the North that voted for the Brexiteers on the 12th of December. But that is again dishonest speculation. That is not about housing. And it's not about democracy, not about accountability. And this is the cartoon. This is a rare cartoon because it's a rare cartoon because at the expense of Robert Jenrick, who is posing with currency notes stuffed through his backside and posing near the building site of West Ferry Road Printworks, where a very happy, satisfied looking porn billionaire, Richard Desmond, is standing celebrating. Now, this is an issue that, this is Peter Brooks, the cartoonist, has done that, and he's catching the mood of the general commentariat on the housing planning, removal of the planning restrictions and regulations. And the Times is running an editorial supporting Jenrick, except that it has got a question about details of how the deregulation regime would be implemented, brought about. So all these papers, including the Guardian, the Daily Mirror, are in effect playing silent role in relation to the attacks on the regulation and democratic say that is contained in this program of scrapping existing housing and planning regulations by the conservatives. And the Sun on page 4 runs a token story about BBC Race Row. There was this N word used in a BBC item, and there were 18,000 plus complaints against that. But there is no real examination in this piece or any piece about the daily racism that is represented in the agenda run by the BBC, which is not just worse than the use of the N word, not that the N word should be used, but worse in terms of the effect and the impact on the lives and the says of people that the daily racism inflicts and causes and perpetuates and perpetrates. And of course, there is the hateful, page 13. It is doing a play on out of order and saying that migrants are invading Britain. So this is the hateful content collection, an indifferent collection about the planning deregulation. So there is no real say positively about what should happen to meet the needs of the people, facing the housing needs and facing the hatred and the violations of their rights in relation to having to come to Britain and those who are victims of racism, racist discrimination every day. So this is this edition 8:15 GMT on Friday, the 7th of August 2020. This diagnosis is ending at this time